I'm Rosalyn Schanzer, the author and illustrator of Witches, the absolutely true tale of disaster in Salem. To the Puritans living near Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, anyone could be a witch. Your tiny baby sister, your kind old grandfather, or even your own dog. This scratchboard illustration shows what happened when a tavern keeper named Bridget Bishop became the first person to be formally tried and hanged for the crime of witchcraft. Her fate was finally sealed when a neighbor testified against her. He claimed that a hairy black monster with the face of a man, the body of a monkey, and the feet of a rooster had swooped into his window bearing a message from the devil. The neighbor rushed outside only to see Bridget Bishop walking away past his apple trees. Just then, the monster reappeared and swooped away again, scattering apples as it flew. The neighbor was so terrified that he couldn't speak a word for 3 days. Witches, the absolutely true tale of disaster in Salem, uncovers the story of the victims, accused witches, crooked officials, and mass hysteria that took 20 lives and ruined hundreds more. How could this happen? Read all about it, if you dare.
The following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools.
Nonfiction is true storytelling, and joining me to talk about the craft of nonfiction writing is award-winning children's author Rosalyn Schanzer. Rosalyn, thanks so much for joining us in the MTA studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking to you. Today we're going to look at 3 books: George versus George, The American Revolution as Seen from Both Sides, What Darwin Saw, The Journey That Changed the World, and John Smith Escapes Again. In each book, Rosalyn Schanzer provides readers with lively tales of true events and real people. With Rosalyn Schanzer's help, we focus on how students can strengthen their own nonfiction storytelling skills. Rosalyn, you brought with you many journals and lots of pictures. Tell me, how do these tools help you shape a story?
Oh, I know that some kids in school have to write journals, and I do it because I love to do it. And sometimes I use my journals for research for my books. So for example, this little journal, it says Ecuador and the Galapagos. And
I love the way you've decorated the front of your journal.
Oh, thanks, it's fun. That's something to do on the airplane, or when you get back, you get to do that. I wrote the book, What Darwin Saw, that you had mentioned, and here are my notes. So up at the top it says Sea of Cortez. That was another trip. But I decorate everything so that I can find it and so that I have fun doing it. And I write down things that are helpful for me for my research. It's one of the ways that I do my research. And then I also put in lots of facts, and I take photographs. And I'll show you one more journal because they're really, really fun to do. If anybody whose kids that's watching this has to do a journal, put down the fun stuff as well as the true stuff so that you have a good time writing your journals. Darwin, he spent his whole trip, his 5-year journey around the world, writing journals just like mine and little books like mine, and came back and made a whole scientific career that made him one of the most famous scientists of all time just from doing that. And I use photographs and all kinds of other research as well.
All right, so how do you incorporate, what are we looking at here? He's a gorgeous little guy.
Oh, that is a frog from Costa Rica. And I take pictures to use as research for my pictures, whether I'm doing a book on them or not. You're looking at a picture of a tortoise that I used in my Charles Darwin book, and actually I can show you here he is riding a tortoise, and the tortoise that's in the photograph is actually in my book. So I'll hold up the book here and you can see, right, there's the tortoise that I used. And somewhere in the pictures, I believe you have a picture of an iguana doing push-ups.
Right there.
Right, and I think that you have a photograph of that too. So I got those on the trip because I take gazillions of photographs. It's so much fun way to do research. So part of doing the research for a book is to have the adventure of doing it. And then there are many other kinds of research that we can talk about too as we go along.
And the journal is a perfect way to keep track of all of those wonderful adventures and experiences because we think we'll remember them, and not always the case.
You can remember the big stuff, but the little stuff and the funny things that happen from day to day that make your story so much fun, you'll forget it. So write it down, like you're talking to your friends on your cell phone or whatever. Tell those stories that you'd tell them that would be fun to hear. Put it in your journals.
You never know when you may need it again.
Right.
Well, let's open the phone lines for student questions. If you would like to join us via Skype, our address is meet_the_author. As those questions filter in, let's take a look at John Smith Escapes Again. This book is packed with detailed drawings and information. So Rosalyn, how did you organize your material for this book?
Well, this is the book John Smith Escapes Again. And instead of writing a straight biography, which could put everybody to sleep and they'd be snoring in the floor if you told every single detail of his life, I made the title John Smith Escapes Again, and it is about 13 of his greatest escapes that he ever made. And so he was a really good escape artist, and Pocahontas wasn't the only person who ever helped him escape. So
Pocahontas is the most famous one that we know about
she's the
in
most
relationship
famous
with John.
one,
Yeah.
and actually she wasn't his girlfriend. She was a little kid, and they never were boyfriend, girlfriend at all. So that's a surprise. When you learn about history and write about
who are we
history,
looking at here
there
on the
she
screen?
is. Oh yeah, that's Pocahontas.
That doesn't
And
look
you'll-
like the Pocahontas I'm familiar with.
Right, she's bald, and there's a reason for that. When you were a kid, and he thought she was about 10, or maybe she was 11, some people think she may have been as old as 12, but I don't think so. Kids, little girls, they shave their heads until they got old enough, you know, to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So her head would have been shaved all the way from the front to about the middle of the back. And then she would have had a long braid down her back. And the reason that she's red is partly as decoration, but really they painted themselves red because it kept away mosquitoes, and there were lots of mosquitoes in southern Virginia, in Jamestown, where they were. So it was bug spray.
How about that? That's something that I did not know either. Now, talk to me about some of the pictures that you chose and some of the stories that you chose to include about the adventures you learned about John Smith.
Well, I had a trick for the way that I did his whole life, and in fact, on the end papers is a map that's interesting because it shows every place he ever went in his whole entire life. I see that there's a flap in part of front of it. But he came from England, and he escaped from pirates. Let's look at the back of the book. He escaped from not only just Indians like you've heard about before, but he escaped from rich people who were mad at him because he was low-born. And he escaped from the Turks who he was at war with when he was a soldier over in Eastern Europe. And he escaped from pirates, and he even escaped from being a slave. And not everybody knows that. John Smith was an escape. So they're death-defying escapes, really.
Well, I'd like to open this to some students waiting to hear more about
good.
John Smith.
Okay.
They're from Waynewood Elementary School, and they are joining us via Skype. So let's find out
Okay,
what they'd like to know.
excellent.
Hi, everybody. What's your question?
How did you get inspired to write John Smith Escapes Again, and what did you enjoy most about writing John Smith Escapes Again?
Well, the thing that I enjoyed and how I got excited about it was I had read all those not true stories, like from Walt Disney and people like that, who had told untrue tales of John Smith. And so I thought he was going to be kind of a bad guy and that she really was his girlfriend. So the fun thing was to find out that she wasn't his girlfriend and that he had so many other adventures that when he wrote the story of his life, which was a big, thick book, and he wrote a whole bunch of other books, she was one paragraph on one page of one book. That's how important she was to him in real life as a story. However, that was the rescue part of it. However, she was important to the people in Jamestown because she did help bring them food, but they were just friends. And I loved that he had been all around the world and nobody knew about that yet. And I thought people should know that he's one of the greatest heroes that America ever had, because before the Civil War, the two most popular heroes in America were, of course, George Washington, but the other one was Captain John Smith. During the Civil War, somebody wrote mean stories about him. They were from the North, and they wanted to make the South's heroes look bad, and it gave him a bad rep. And so after that, they didn't talk about John Smith the same way that they did before, and I thought we should make him famous again. So I wrote John Smith Escapes Again so that you could know that.
And I learned so much about it as well. We have another question from Wayne Wood, so let's find out what they want to know. Hi, what's your question?
My question is, would you like to be a buddy of John Smith when he went on all of his adventures? Why or why not?
Well, why would I love to? Because he went everywhere, and I love adventures, and I will travel all over the world to have adventures. Why not? Because he would get in sticky situations all the time because he was tough and he was brave. Why would I like to be with him? Because he was so clever that he could figure his way out of any sticky situation. So I would and would not like to go with him. And that's your answer.
I want to thank our students from Waynewood. What great questions they had for you today. And you're right, I've read about you as well, and you have a lot of adventures under your own belt, not just John Smith. So thank you all so much for your questions. We will be taking more student questions in a moment. Our guest, author Rosalyn Schanzer, invited the MTA crew for a behind-the-scene tour of her basement. Well, actually it's her studio. Let's start at the research table.
Whenever I do research for a book, I read every possible book I can about the subject. So you'll see there's one about Jefferson Davis, and here's one that's a famous, big, thick book for grown-ups called A Team of Rivals. You're sort of going to guess what I'm writing about. It's about the Civil War. Even magazines can be part of my research, but I have to make sure that they wrote the material correctly because I write all nonfiction. So everything has to be 100% accurate. I go find original source material, which means what people really did say during that time period, and I put that in my books. And when I do the pictures, I go back on my computer sometimes and look for portraits of real people at the same age they were when I'm talking about them. And I go through all my stacks of research that I've gathered up in my library and find pictures of the exact time period, what people wore, what the horses, what their saddles look like, what their rifles look like, what their buttons look like, and what their wigs looked like, even if they wore powdered wigs like George Washington, for example.
Well, your research includes everything from magazine articles to primary sources. What I've noticed in my readings is you never approach a book the same way. How do you make the choice of how you're going to start a project?
Well, I like to have a hook, and as you saw with John Smith, my hook was his adventures. So, for example, in What Darwin Saw, I wanted to do two things, and my hook was for most of my source material to use his journals, and that's why these journals are so helpful. But the other thing that I tried to do is to explain why a young, adventurous guy that's much closer to the age of the kids that are my audience, why he started thinking about the theory of evolution. So each spread in the book is designed to explain something that stuck in his mind that made him think that the Earth is changing. So this is a picture, for example, of a tsunami, because they had tsunamis on the western coast of South America while he was there. And between the tsunamis and the volcanoes, it reshaped the Earth right in front of his eyes. So the Earth couldn't have been the same forever and ever as exactly as we've all seen it now.
Well, what about George versus George? What was the hook for that book?
In George versus George, I wanted to tell a story that somebody had never told before, which is the story of the American Revolution as seen from both sides. When I was a kid, I learned that every single thing that George Washington did was wonderful, perfect, and good, and that the soldiers in America were wonderful, and that King George III was basically a blithering idiot who was crazy. And that was one-sided because we won the war, and I thought it'd be interesting to see what his side of the story was, and I found out that he was actually the most educated king England had ever had. Queen Elizabeth was the only one more well-educated at that time.
Well, we have a couple of students with email questions about George
good.
versus George, so let's hear the first one. This one is from Jenna, and Jenna would like to know if there's anything you could change about George versus George, what would it be? That's a tough question.
Well, Jenna, here's how the process works. I have to write every word, and I have to do all the pictures over and over again and present them to my editors and designers many times. And by the time we've gone over everything in great, great detail all the time, I pretty much have it the way that I want it to be. So almost always the books turn out the best that they can possibly be. There are some exceptions. I once did a book on called How Ben Franklin Stole the Lightning, and I put curly clouds in the sky. And I loved those curly clouds, and they took a long time to do. But my editor decided that she didn't like curly clouds and that I should make them plainer, so I had to redo it. So it's not always exactly the way you wanted, but we really try hard to make it exactly the way you want it by the time you're done.
We have a question about George versus George. This one's from Matthew, and he wants to know, did you work with others on this book?
Matthew, this is a really interesting question. I'll show you an example of where I did work with somebody else, and it's from the battle between the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis, two ships. The Bonhomme Richard was from America and the Serapis was from England, and the person that I needed to talk to find out how that battle actually looked was the world's foremost expert on this battle in the North Sea. So here's the picture of the battle, and the gentleman's name was Peter Reevely, and he actually is British, who lives in Florida. He sent me plans of the ship exactly as it would have looked at the time, the two ships hooked together, and he even showed me where the moon would have been and what colors went on the ship and everything. And I would never have known that because it's not just that easy to find, but because I could talk to him, I could draw that picture correctly. So I do go to experts too.
Well, Rosalyn, we have some students who want to know a little bit more from you, and they're Skyping in from Katy, Texas. They're from Cypress Lakes High School, so let's find out what they'd like to know.
Okay, great.
Okay, hi everybody.
Hello.
What is your question?
I have a question. What process do you use to simplify complex information like deaths or murders or hanging or anything of that sort?
Okay. Well, it depends how old the people are who are reading the books. So there are certain things that I can say, for example, in the book Witches that you saw the trailer for at the beginning of the book. That's more of a YA book, so I can say things that I can't say to younger kids. But I don't leave anything out. I always try to be totally honest. I don't leave out any of the facts. What I do leave out is a lot of the in-between extra words because I have to leave room for the pictures in my book. So I have to make the words as juicy as possible and as interesting as possible, and still use as few words as possible to tell that story.
Okay, thank you for that question. And just so you know, these students have been writing children's books and sent some in for us to take a look at as well. And I know they have another question waiting, so let's find out what it is.
Okay.
Well, I have a question. How do you organize the historical aspects of your story in order to make it child friendly?
How do I organize them into what?
How do you organize historical information where the child can read it and enjoy it?
Oh, yeah, you have to, I will tell you my method for doing this. It's called the meat and salt method. I pick out all the facts, make sure I have the basis of the story right. And so every detail has to be correct, and that's the meat. But the salt is the juicy little tidbits, the things that are funny or shocking or amazing that I can put into the story to grab you guys' attention. So that's how I organize it. It's a mixture of meat and salt, and it makes you want to turn each page. So at the end of each page, I put in something that will make you wonder what's on the next page. It might be art, and it might be the words that pull you in.
Okay, thank you. That's some great advice for these students. Do you have any other questions?
How do you finish a book on such a short deadline?
Well, some of the deadlines are shorter or longer than others. So George versus George actually took me 2 years to write because I had to do all the research and I had to do research for the artwork too, so that every single button on their clothes was absolutely correct and all their guns were correct, what we talked about a little bit. And finding that information is just as hard as finding the words for the book. And there was another piece to that question. Anyway, does that sort of answer it? It took 2 years to do that one. Oh, the rest of the question is, how do I do it on such a short deadline? Some things are done, I used to do books in 2 weeks, so I've gone anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, and it is deadline dependent for sure. Just some books take longer than others.
Well, that's great advice for these students, and good luck with your book writing projects. And thank you for sharing them with us, and thank you for joining us today. Journals, outlines, research, and drafts are all part of the writing process. As an illustrator, Rosalyn also has to consider visual issues such as layout and drawing techniques. In just a moment, Rosalyn explains some of her design challenges. Don't go away.
The artwork for Witches, the absolutely true tale of disaster in Salem, was done in scratchboard. It's done on a black board that's hard, and it has white clay painted on it, and then over the top of the white clay is black India ink. And I have to use scratch tools to take away the black layer so that you'll see a white picture. Scratch tools are like X-Acto knives and anything sharp that I can cut through to see the white. Here's another picture from that book. So everybody was accusing everybody else of being a witch in Salem, and they were all pointing their fingers at anybody they could because they thought even your own kindly grandmother could be a witch, and even your own dog. And they would blame their children and their mother and their dad. So I had to show how that would be. That's one book. Remember I talked about George Washington, and this is real artwork that's very different from the other one. I did it on canvas that's rough. You'll notice that there are two cannon firing at each other in that picture. And I wanted the title to go in the big puff of smoke because King George III and George Washington were enemies during the American Revolution. And my editor and art director decided that we wanted the title to be bigger. So I will show you how the book came out. Now remember that cloud, and then you'll see how it actually turned out. We wanted the title to say George versus George, the American Revolution as seen from both sides. So we had to make a bigger space for it. So I had to change the artwork. And that means
that everybody who's an artist doesn't get things perfectly every time, and you have to redraw as well as sometimes rewrite what you wrote. This should be fun to look at because I have to draw sketches before I do my books, and then I draw little teeny thumbnail sketches like these for each spread of the book. A spread is 2 pages next to each other when you open the book. And they're very, very rough. It's just to see if the type will fit and what pictures are going to go on what page. So after I get that approved, then I do a big sketch that's fancy, and if that gets approved, I do the final artwork. So here's the cover of John Smith Escapes Again, and you'll see it has a big blank space right up there so that when they print it, you can see the title inside that box, and they'll use type to put inside the box. And this is the front and back cover. So when you pull away from the book a little bit, you can see that the front cover, when it folds, will be right here, and finally the book will fold around and the back cover is over here.
I'm always fascinated to learn the many different ways that writers work. It's fascinating, it really is. We have the Waynewood students back via Skype. They have more questions for you, so let's find out what they want to know. Hi, Waynewood. What is your question?
If you could go to all the events in your book, would you change anything or leave it, and why?
Oh, I would love to be in all those adventures. I write these books because I'm so excited about the places that the people went. The first nonfiction book I ever wrote, for example, was called How We Crossed the West, The Adventures of Lewis and Clark. And boy, I read their journals to write that book too, and I really felt like I was right alongside them on their journey. So, you know, it's all of the above is the answer. I'd like to go to all those places, and that is exactly why it's one of my biggest reasons for writing the books. The only place maybe I wouldn't like to have been was in Salem, where the witch hunts were.
Okay, and thank you so much for your question. And we have another Waynewood student waiting to ask you a question. Good. Hi, what's your question today?
My question is, how long did it take to get all the information for your story, and why did you choose the sources you did?
Okay, first, how long did it take? My work is divided into the 3 pieces, and I really spend as much time gathering up the information as I do writing and illustrating the stories. So if it took me 2 years, you know, I would have divided up the 3 years. I would have divided up the time into 3 parts. Some of them are harder to research than others, like George versus George. I did not know anything about King George III, and not very many people in America had written about him, so that took a little bit longer. And the second part of the question, why did I use certain sources? Well, of course, I have a lot of sources that I use, and I am an equal opportunity source user. So I use my journals, I use my photographs a lot, and I use original source material, which is material that's written by people who were really there at the time, because they're just as juicy as anything you might put in your journal, because they come from those people's letters and their secret diaries and all kinds of things like that. And I use books written by experts so that I get everybody's point of view about any given story. So that's how I pick as many sources of research as I possibly can.
Well, thank you, Waynewood, for your great questions. And Rosalyn, thank you so much for joining us today. I wish we had more time. I've learned so much from you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for your questions.
For more information about Rosalyn Schanzer, visit her website at www.rosalynschanzer.com. If you would like to see more of Rosalyn's studio, visit us at the Fairfax Network. For the Fairfax Network, I'm Della Kidd. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep dreaming.